Thank you very much. And without further ado, let's move on to the next session, which very much continues the themes that we've been hearing about up to now. This one will take us up to lunch. So I'd like to invite Minister Dendias, Ambassador Tsunis, David Harris to come to the stage, please. Also Sergei Konoplyov. And we're joined also remotely by James Stavridis. I hope that connection is working as well. So please join me.
Out of time, how you would like me to get my comments? Do you want me to boil it down to what
That
I
would be
say?
great. We'll keep it quite concise, yes.
A couple of thoughts, but not very short.
Very good. So if you go at the, if you go at the end, yes. Okay. Good. Great to see you. Hi, great to see you. And I see that the connection is working, so Admiral Stavridis, very welcome. I hope you can hear me as well as we can see you. Excellent. 2 thumbs, that's what I like to, that's what I like to hear. That's great. So let's dive straight in to the theme of how can Europe mitigate the current security threats. We've been discussing the security threats just now, and let's start with Minister Dendias, Minister of National Defense for Greece. How can we mitigate the threats?
Well, an honest answer would be, it would be very difficult, if possible. But that's really not a case for jokes. I'll start by saying the obvious, that we have found ourselves in a very, very difficult situation, and a situation not anticipated. As far as Greece is concerned and the region is concerned, we are facing a war in our northeast, a war in our southeast, a totally destabilized northern Africa, and speaking especially about the Sahel region, 2 failed states, one Libya, one Syria, a very awkward situation by a non-state actor which threatens the freedom of navigation in the North Indian Ocean and the Red Sea. I'm speaking about the Houthis. And an overall situation in which humanity goes back to a level of violence that we hoped we have left behind when we entered the 21st century. I think that's a rather accurate description.
That's all. That's the only thing you have to deal with. That's little list.
No, there's some more. For example, the Western Balkans situation, which is far from ideal. We have hoped for a much faster convergence toward the European acquis and membership of the European Union. And of course, the internal political situation in most of the Western democracies is a challenging one, again, to put it mildly. So that's the overall situation that we're facing. Now, if one would start answering on how I propose to address all these issues, one has to deal with them separately. Ukraine, I think, Minister Kuleba spoke very eloquently. They're fighting an existential fight for the last 2 years. It is a miracle that they have survived the Russian invasion. Please scratch your memories. Remember how we felt the first 24 hours after the Russian invasion. Almost nobody would have believed that Ukraine would have been able to stand its own and even gain back territory in the last 2 years. If now we're speaking about threats in the Eastern Mediterranean and Gaza, and the overall situation between Israel and the Palestinians, again, I have to say that this is something we have to address as a big challenge. It's not something that has to do with just Israel or the Palestinians. It's much bigger than that. But of course, nobody should ever, ever forget what has happened in the 7th of October. Another challenge that has been rather overlooked is the situation in the Sahel. I have to say that I'm always saying that from Brussels, maybe Niger or Mali or Chad looks very far away and not very threatening. But there is a big but. And I'll go back to history. For Europe to be safe and secure, the situation in North Africa, and that includes necessarily the Sahel, has to be safe and secure. And please remember one historical example, and I will bring a second one more recent. Why was the Roman Empire always fighting for control of Northern Africa? Why Scipio, the African, went to North Africa? Why was the Carthago delenda est something we have all learned when we learn Roman history? It is clear that for the security of Europe, control and security of North Africa is essential. But we have a much more recent example. Before D-Day, before Operation Overlord, it was Operation Torch. The Allies first invaded North Africa before they felt secure to go to Normandy and liberate Europe. So, to cut a long story short, we have to address all these huge challenges simultaneously. I will go back to Red Sea and the Indian Ocean in the continuation of our discussion. I'm going there this Saturday with High Representative Borrell to look at Operation Aspides and the Greek ship and the Greek frigate that is leading that operation. But our challenge now is to deal with all these threats simultaneously. Easier said than done.
Absolutely. Can I, just before we move on, ask you, you're going to be at the NATO summit, the 75th anniversary summit.
Yes, in Washington.
What do you expect to come out of that meeting, and in what ways can it start to contribute to...
First of all, one has to admit even that if some people do not like NATO, but they have to accept one thing, that NATO has been the most successful military alliance on history. Now we have to, Ukraine testifies to that, by the way, but we have to move the extra mile. And by that I mean that NATO has also to become something more, which, by the way, I believe that is within the NATO DNA. To move from the point of being a military alliance to become an alliance of values, of principles, and be able to export those values and principles around the world. That, I believe, will be the challenge for NATO as it moves towards 100 years of existence. And small steps in every meeting, that's what I expect of every NATO summit.
Maybe this would be a moment to turn to Admiral Stavridis, because you were, of course, Supreme Allied Commander for NATO in Europe. So you know of what you speak and what can be expected now with the Carlyle Group, but you observe closely, obviously, what goes on in the alliance. What do you expect from the summit, and how does it play into the various strategic threats that the Minister has just described?
Let me just begin with the numbers for a minute, because they're impressive and not everybody appreciates them. Here's an alliance 75 years old that has a collective defense budget well over $1 trillion, that's with a T, $1 trillion. It has a population that is around 800 million, 3 million active duty troops, men and women, almost all volunteers at this point, another 4 million in reserves, 800 warships, and 15 to 20,000 military aircraft. So immense capability, as we heard just a moment ago. Secondly, values-based. And I think this is an organization that was conceived in liberty, was born in democracy. I always feel proud as a Greek American to think that this particular conference is held in Athens, Greece, in the cradle of democracy, where Greek patriots stopped Persian invaders 2,500 years ago in the Bay of Salamis. So you're in the right place to have this conversation. And as to the 75th birthday of this extraordinary organization, I will simply say, obviously, job one is Ukraine and stopping Vladimir Putin. That's quite clear. I think what's interesting, and I will be focused on the level of discussion, what are jobs 2, 3, 4, and maybe 5? So I think a major effort, and we have a new Secretary General. I know Prime Minister Rutte very well from my days as SACEUR. He's the right man for this moment. I would put a lot of emphasis in the alliance on cyber security and preparing for the impact of artificial intelligence. These are two areas the alliance is not particularly moved at speed upon. These are areas that are changing in front of our eyes in the battlefields of Ukraine and even in the urban warfare terrain of Gaza. So cyber and artificial intelligence, let's see how the summit can make some progress there. Number two, we've just added two marvelous new nations to this alliance, now 32. That's, of course, Sweden and Finland. Therefore, we have to look not only to the south, and I fully agree, the Mediterranean and the challenges to the south are profound and real. We have a new border to defend in the high north. So I think the Arctic and what is happening there is particularly important. And I add to that the 600-mile northern border of the alliance, now Finnish and Swedish borders with Russia. Where are the contingency plans to prepare for both defensive and God forbid, but let's be realistic, offensive operations on those northern frontiers? And then finally, and I'll conclude here because I know we're short of time, I think that we have to think about NATO's engagement across the globe. And here I don't mean trying to stretch the alliance to become a global power, but certainly NATO nations can operate alongside the United States and other Pacific powers in confronting authoritarianism and challenges in Asia. I'm not looking for a NATO flag on freedom of navigation patrols in the South China Sea, but I am looking for the navies of NATO nations to be involved in those kind of operations. Some have done so already, 3 or 4. Let's see if we can improve in all those areas. So there's a quick snapshot of some things to think about. I'll conclude just with a shout out to the wonderful ambassador of the United States to Greece, my good friend, Ambassador George Tsunis. Yasu, and thank you for taking a moment with me, all of you.
Great. Well, we're going to come to Ambassador Tsunis in a minute. I just want to pick up one thing on the NATO summit, and thank you for that very succinct summary of both of NATO's reach and also the agenda as you see it. There is, however, a shadow hanging over Washington summit, and that is the shadow of, how great will the commitment or how deep will the commitment be to NATO potentially under a Trump 2 presidency if that were to happen. Is that something that concerns you? Is it any point in worrying about it? And if there is, what can be done to make sure that NATO continues to survive and thrive into a presidency that may be less intrinsically committed to the alliance?
It does concern me. It is worth worrying about, and I think we ought to be fireproofing the NATO alliance in the case of a Trump presidency. I know many of the senior advisors who will be coming in if there is a second Trump administration. I commend the article, for example, in the Council on Foreign Relations publication, not as good as The Economist, but it's a pretty good magazine. It's called Foreign Affairs. There's a lengthy article in this month by Robert O'Brien, who was the final national security advisor. You could look at the writings of Eldridge Colby, who's very focused on the Pacific but has succinct things to say about NATO, or Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg. Know them all. These are all rational actors. Their view of NATO is it is a net good, but for the United States to fully engage and continue to offer a nuclear umbrella, full protection, it's going to require NATO defense spending. Here, I'm not going to surprise you. to track up to the minimum of 2%. I would say the best thing NATO could do in the face of a Trump presidency is to immediately up the goal, move the goalpost to 2.5% of GDP. The United States spends 3.5% of GDP. I spent a lot of time a decade ago arguing this. I'm heartened by the improvement in the alliance in this regard thus far. I think now we're up to close to 20 nations that meet 2%. But if you want to continue to have enthusiastic participation from a Trump-led United States, you're going to have to up that game a bit. That would be the short answer to the question, how to make sure that NATO stays in effective ground with the Trump administration.
Well, fascinating. I think not only upping the goal, but actually meaning it would be important. But so, Ambassador Tsunis, after that wonderful shout out for the Greek American Day that we have here in Athens, your perspective after having served now in Athens for some time on the outlook, but also the role of Greece, I think would be really interesting to hear.
Look, I think the challenges that are confronting us, and certainly confronted us at the invasion, were there. They may have been simmering at times under the surface, and at times they weren't. I wish that there was a little bit more muscularity exercised in 2004 when this happened to Georgia. I wish there was a little more muscularity exercised when it happened to Crimea. Mr. Putin's very clear on what he wants to do. I mean, he was signaling messaging on Ukraine for many months. And if you look at some of his speeches, he's now talking about other countries. And probably not, unlikely a full-on invasion. But he is talking about a country or two in the Baltics, and he's talking about Moldova. Now, if you look at the Balkans, and 2 years ago I appeared on this stage, and I thought I said something provocative. We as the West have failed the Balkans. We have promised them rapid ascension to the EU and NATO. We've promised them Western investment. We've promised them solidarity, and we've overpromised and underdelivered. And, people pay attention. So as a lot of times it's a resource issue and it's a support issue, we have to be true to our word that we're going to show up, get on the playing field. No one prefers anyone other than being in a transatlantic relationship. No one prefers aligning themselves with the PRC or Russia. They prefer to be with the United States and Europe, which are democratic in nature. But we have to show up, and we have to show solidarity, and we have to show support, and we have to be muscular. These challenges can solve themselves. It's logistics. The admiral will talk about Eisenhower's great quote, "On wars are fought about logistics." We're going to have to be more muscular with our Wales Pledge. Prior to the invasion, I think a handful of countries complied with the 2014 Wales Pledge. Greece, I will tell you, for the last 3-4 years has been between 3 and 4%, not 2%, and 45 to 52% on weapons systems, not 20%. I think we're up to 22 nations now. And I agree, we have to all up it, because nations that seek to change borders by force only understand one thing: strength and deterrence. And I don't want to go backwards, and I don't want to be a Monday morning quarterback, but a little bit more deterrence, especially in missile defense, probably would have been more helpful. We need to be more proactive, not reactive, because this is not only about Ukraine. This is a message to every autocrat out there who has similar designs, and they want to see, is this a war of attrition? Are they just going to wait us out? Are we going to abandon the Ukrainians? We talk about democracy and how important it is and how all freedoms and rights spring from democracy. But the only ones who are dying for democracy right now are the Ukrainian people. And the least we can do is support them. And I'm glad to see it looks like everyone has finally gotten on board to do so. The admiral quotes Themistocles and why they were fighting in the Battle of Salamis. They were fighting for their mothers and their fathers and their wives and their daughters and their children and their sisters. And this is exactly what is happening in Ukraine. And we are honor-bound to support them because it's so much more than Ukraine. It's about the world in which we want to live in. Very practically, I come from the business community. This is going to be about logistics. We have to make real the vertical corridor. And it's more than just electricity and nat gas and LNG, where Greece is now redrawing the energy map in Southern Europe, Alexandroupoli, Rebethusa, IGB. We need all connectivity, data center connectivity. We need to continue to support Alexandroupoli in that we move 12,000 pieces of NATO military equipment. We need to have commercial connectivity through Greek ports into the Black Sea. This is where Bulgaria and Romania are incredibly helpful. We need to utilize the storage capability that exists in Ukraine. Gazprom is not going to extend that contract, and the Ukrainians aren't either. We need to figure out how we're going to keep the lights on in Ukraine. That's going to come through Greece. It should come through Greece. But connecting railroads, connecting roads, border crossings, logistics, trades, grain silos, commercial logistics, data center connectivity, as well as energy and electricity, and decarbonizing at the same time, it creates prosperity, which creates stability, which creates peace. We need to continue to press upon all of these things because the underpinning of a strong military and a strong deterrence is strong economies.
So just picking you up on the centrality of Greece, actually, that you were alluding to there, we heard this morning, actually, what a role Greece has to play, and actually strong US-Greek partnership has been going really for a number of years now. It was something that previous administration prioritized as well. Sitting as ambassador here in Athens, how do you see that developing now? Is it becoming more important than ever? Is it taking on new forms?
It's not just important, it's critical. Let me be very, very careful how I phrase this. I mean, we're dealing with crises to the north and to the south, and Greece plays a vital role on how the United States shows muscularity and provides assistance. I think if you ask General Cavoli, it is a critical component. Greece is a country that has capability, is impactful, but I want to make something very clear. NATO solidarity, they act with honor and principles and values. I have never, in the almost 2.5 years that I've been in this position, and I'm the one that's going to talk to the various ministers, my friend Nikos here and the Prime Minister, they've never acted in a transactional manner. The rule of law is their guidepost. And every time we have come in for a request on NATO solidarity or the defense of democracy or an important Western value, Greece has said yes. They said yes instantly. And even when it was difficult. So because of their location, because of incredible assets like Ladis, Alexandroupoli, Suda Bay, which is the only place in the region we can park an aircraft carrier, because of their capability, the relationship, a sense of reliability, and by the way, a Greek armed forces that is quickly being modernized, that we are providing our very most significant weapon systems to. Greece is playing an incredible role in NATO interoperability and energy security, as well as a bulwark to anti-democratic forces.
Excellent. Well, if I could switch focus now to the other big and disturbing conflict in the region, the one between Israel and Palestinians in Gaza. David Harris, former Chief Executive Officer of the American Jewish Committee and currently Executive Vice Chair of the Institute for the Study of Global Antisemitism and Policy. How do you see this dreadful conflict unfolding over the next few months? And are we, or should we fear and expect a wider regional war, which seems to be one of the big concerns right now?
First of all, it's a pleasure to be with longtime friends on this stage, and thank you for the invitation to come back, Daniel. I want to bridge the two conversations, if I may. I think more than as an act of historical curiosity, all of us need to return to an earlier period in history, particularly the 1920s and 1930s, in order to understand the lessons that were missed then that apply today. The first of which was a failure of imagination, an unwillingness and inability to believe that Adolf Hitler, who spelled out his manifesto in the Landsberg prison in 1924, actually meant what he said when he took office 9 years later. In fact, the New York Times, when he was released from prison, had a headline which read, "Hitler tamed by prison." And the article went on to say that it was expected that Hitler would retire to his native Austria. Do we dare suffer from a failure of imagination again 100 years later? The second lesson that I've learned from this period was the obvious failure of appeasement policy. Now, this has become a cliche, we all say it, and yet there are echoes, at least to me, of a failure to apply those lessons then to today. Edward Daladier was the Prime Minister of France who on September 30th, 1938, after meeting with Hitler in Munich said, and I quote, "Peace is saved." And I don't have to repeat the quotes of Neville Chamberlain upon his return to Britain and the reassurance to the British people they could get a good night's sleep because he returned with peace, with honor. The third lesson I learned was that when an America seeks to create the distance of an ocean and the appearance of neutrality, not wanting again to get involved in Europe as it did in World War I, and grappling with the domestic issues of depression, etc., the world becomes a more dangerous place. And number four, as a Jew, I learned that a world without Israel is a more unsafe place, and not just for the Jews. And now I fast forward. On October the 7th, in American demographic terms, 42,000 people were killed. In American demographic terms, more than 8,000 Americans, if you will, were kidnapped. I asked my friend, the Minister of Defense of Greece, I asked anyone else here in this hall whose portfolio includes defense, how would you react to 42,000 people being killed on your soil in one day, the worst day since the Holocaust? And then I hear earlier today that we need to understand, Daniel, the root causes. One of your earlier speakers said, and then he tried to explain that the root cause of October 7th was occupation. Forgive me. The root cause of October 7th was our inability to understand the ideology of Hamas, its patrons in Tehran, its funders in Qatar, and its driving worldview drawn from the Muslim Brotherhood, because occupation ended in 2005. And then he went on to say the solution is a two-state settlement. Who in their right mind would oppose an enduring, stable two-state solution? But that has been on the international table since 1947. Since UN Resolution 181 put a two-state solution on the table for the first of multiple times. So I fear that once again, in some respects, we're seeing a failure of imagination. We're ducking the issue. The issue is Iran. The issue is Iranian tentacles in Yemen, in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, and yes, here in Europe. And what can Europe do to advance its security? Well, for one thing, not avoid, but confront. Why is the Iran Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, not listed on the EU terrorism list? And why, since 2013, have we lived with this fiction of a Hezbollah that is divided between a military wing that, because of Bulgarian and Cypriot pressure, was added to the EU list, while a political wing is not? As if one can bifurcate an organization that Hezbollah itself insists is a unitary organization. So I believe that we have to not risk, once again, the failure of imagination, not risk making Israel the new Czechoslovakia, but understanding as well that Israel is not just a benefit to the United States or to the Jewish community, but I ask you, I ask the ministers of defense and others, after Israel was attacked on October the 7th, the IDF called for 300,000 reservists to show up. 350,000 reservists showed up from every corner of the world, including several veterans in their 90s. How many countries in our transatlantic community would have that kind of response? What can we learn from Israel? How about national resilience in the home front, since after all, Hamas targeted the home front? How about missile defense? How about military operability in high-density urban zones? Israel should never become a sacrificial lamb. Israel is essential to the security of Europe, just as the United States is. And my last and final point. A lot's been said about the election in the United States. I am one of the last dinosaurs, a political independent and a nonpartisan. And I have only two hopes for this election. One, that whoever wins, wins decisively enough that it doesn't end up in the Supreme Court. And the second, and this may surprise some of you, I'm hoping for divided government. Given the political extremes in the United States, the unwillingness of either side to meet in the middle, the only way to force that encounter, I believe, on a policy level is just that. And with respect to NATO, should Donald Trump return, I want to assure people in this hall and watching on live stream that there are a hell of a lot of us, from the admiral to George to myself, partisan and nonpartisan, who are going to fight like hell to make sure that we don't return to a neo-isolationist policy of the 1930s, because otherwise I don't want ever again to have a future Winston Churchill saying, and the conversation took place with President Roosevelt, and Churchill wrote, "One day President Roosevelt told me that he was asking publicly for suggestions about the war should be called. I, Winston Churchill, said 2 words, unnecessary war. Through unity, through the end of a failure of imagination, through abandonment of appeasement, through strengthening our spine, our collaborative spine, through understanding that soft power without hard power today is no power. That through this kind of combined efforts on both sides of the Atlantic, with friends on the other side, whatever happens in November, we will prevail for only one reason, because we must.
David, thank you. Very strong words. Can I just pick up the Iran question, which you stress is central to the whole problem? Trump administration tried maximum pressure. Previous administrations tried a deal, nuclear deal with Iran. Current administration tried to revise a deal, didn't work, but is still confronting Iran in various ways. What would work in your view? And I come back to my previous question about a regional war. Is a war with Iran, in your view, almost bound to happen now, or with Hezbollah as Iran's proxy, almost bound to happen with Israel, or could it and should it be avoided?
I think the difficulty with answering the question is answering the last part, should it be avoided? Of course, all of us would like nothing better, Daniel, than to avoid the war. That's not under discussion. When President Obama's colleague, Ben Rhodes, I would say rather maliciously tried to frame this in a binary way, those opposed to the 2015 deal were warmongers. There was no third way. For a number of us, there was a third way, and there remains a third way. And the third way is maximum unity, maximum pressure, and no blinking. We know that in 2003, after the Iranian regime saw the power of the United States, people like the leadership of the admiral, how we vanquished Iraq in a matter of seconds, minutes, days. The same Iraq that had fought Iran to a standstill over 8 years, from 1980 to 1988, Iran stopped its weapons of mass destruction programs. They were scared to death. And then over time, they saw the American distraction elsewhere, and then along came different administrations and COVID and economic challenges and divisions within the alliance on Iran. I think we all have to wake up and sing from the same song sheet. I'd like to think Europe has woken up from a rather deep sleep, if you'll permit me, on Iran, not because of Israel, not even because of the 300 missiles lobbed against Israel just a short time ago, but rather because of Ukraine. Because Iran has now showed its cards completely. It is on the side of Russia. It is providing lethal material to Russia, which is combating European and American weapon systems over the skies of Ukraine. So I don't pretend to be the smart aleck day after thinker about Iran. I'm simply here as a kind of alarm clock to my many friends in Europe, in London, in Brussels, in Paris, and in Berlin, for starters, joined by the others, and in Washington, that this is not a can we can continue to kick down the road. It should be painfully obvious. And don't expect, please, Israel, once again at the end of the day, as it did with Iraq in 1981, with a French-built reactor in Osirak, to destroy it. Don't expect Israel, as it did in 2007 in the case of Syria, to go and destroy a plant which the Bush administration had been advised by the Israeli government was a plutonium plant. They had brought soil samples that Israeli intelligence had collected. The Bush administration said, our hands are full with Iraq and Afghanistan. Don't expect this little country of 9.5 million people, 2/3 the size of mighty Belgium, to continue to do the dirty work for a West that needs to wake up and join together, not just in talk, not just in exercises of soft power, not just in occasional expressions of anguish, but in determination to stop Iran. The imbalance of power is considerable, Daniel. If we pull it together, we can do what's happened in 2003, I believe.
Well, you've heard the wake-up call. Sergei, Konoplyov, what are your comments on not just what you've just heard from David Harris, but from the other speakers as well?
Thank you so much. I understand that I'm the last obstacle between you and your lunch, so I try to boil down my comments in the short takeaways. And first of all, congratulations to the person who came with a theme of spiraling through the conflicts. That means spiraling, and just check the dictionary just to make sure it's a drastic and dramatic increase in something. So we definitely have a dramatic increase in conflict, and the Middle East could become even more dangerous place. Previous speakers talk about Taiwan. We don't know what happens in Baltics, Kaliningrad, even Belarus. You know, like we don't have a shortage of potential conflicts. What nobody mentioned today in this panel, in the previous panels, is survival. And preparing for this session, I read some of these briefings of the Minister of Defense, and he told a story when he went to Israel, and in Jerusalem meeting with his counterpart. He said, like, what you do, like in Israel, how you deal with that, and according to what you said, he said, we survive. So we need to survive because we don't know if Putin will use nuclear bomb or not. This is a question nobody asked today, and this is something which puts us in completely different dimensions. Going to Israel, you mentioned, going to history, you mentioned 38. I mentioned the year 1939, when the Soviet Union at that time decided that his security was damaged by Finland. And they asked Finland government to give away a couple of hectares of land, kilometers of land, and Finland government decided to say no. So what happened? The Soviet Union sacrificed 250,000 Soviet soldiers and got part of the land. And at that time, Finland decided to deal with that and give away lands to maintain a sovereignty. That's what might Ukraine do. We don't know. Second point, unity. Many people use this word today, and even reading the statements of the outgoing Secretary General of NATO and upcoming Secretary of NATO, it's unity. But unity doesn't come without resources. And I'm very glad that Admiral Stavridis mentioned that now we're going not only 2 point, but we're going 2.5 and sometimes 3%. And in 2014, there was a pledge investment fund, which already got more than $600 billion. And the increase of the spending for the military and defense, if I'm not mistaken, it's about 10 or 11% by the year last year. That means we have this muscle, and we need to have muscles. The only thing this muscle is not used when Soviet troops decided to invade Finland, they decided to invade Czechoslovakia, they decided to invade Hungary, they decided to invade Georgia, Crimea. The response was weak. Now what Putin finally achieved, first of all, he's the best NATO salesman of the year, because the Finland and Sweden joined the club. And from the history, if you know like what is the total title of Russian Tsar was, it was Tsar of Russia, Empire of Poland, and Grand Duke of Finland. That's why I think people of Finland did a good decision to join NATO before Putin decides to get, when they say historical lands, and his views include Poland, Baltic states, and Finland. We remember what happened to a person in Italy named Mussolini, who decided to gather Roman lands. and how that ended. Red lines. I don't think we should be afraid of red lines, and NATO should put some muscles in that. Going briefly to NATO summit, many people talk about what NATO should do, what NATO should not be doing. First of all, Ukraine. I'm ethnically Ukrainian. I'm a retired colonel of Ukrainian armed forces, and I might be biased, but I think that Ukraine belongs to NATO. I mean, like, Ukraine is doing what NATO is, what it's supposed to do, keep Russians out. And I think that Ukrainian armed forces are probably the strongest and more prepared and using more innovations than any other countries. Lesson from history, you remember after the Second World War, Germany was divided by countries, by sectors. But Western Germany, despite of that, was taken to NATO. So if something happens and we have peace, I mean, not peace talks, but some negotiations, and the war will stop, the war will not end. The war will only stop in Ukraine. That part of Ukraine still will be Ukrainian, qualifies, more than qualifies to become part of NATO. And the final, I have 8 seconds, final, we need to look how to revise the Washington Treaty. The Washington Treaty was written many, many years ago before we had iPhones or Tesla. You know, like, a military attack is not precisely, is too fuzzy now as a term to invoke Article 5. And this is a loophole. I remember when there was a Falkland War, and the Great Britain asked NATO to invoke Article 5. They say, well, we are in the North Atlantic part, not in the South Atlantic part. So there are plenty of loopholes, and it's only once it was invoked. And I think what happens right now, every country is willing to donate and help Ukraine because they understand it's not war with Ukraine, it's war which might spill over on other countries, and that we will need to survive. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, of course, the only time it was invoked was when America was attacked on 9/11.
That's correct.
Come back to you, Minister, on this question of the expansion of NATO with Finland and Sweden. What do you see in practical terms in NATO with that new capabilities, that new, obviously very long border with Russia that entails? But do you see it on the ground making a more muscular alliance?
Well, first of all, it's something, let us be honest and frank, nobody believed that we will see in our lifetime. So really, congratulations to President Putin for achieving that. But having said that, I think it's beneficial both ways. First of all, two new, developed, democratic countries are coming to the NATO alliance. And of course, we see border as an exposure towards Russia. But can we please see it otherwise as well? We're having a bigger say in what's happening in a very crucial part of the world. And I'm speaking about the Arctic route now, which, because of climate change, it's becoming much more important for navigation. So having these two countries in NATO is very important. But yet again, I'll go back to how I finished in my first approach. I believe to an alliance of democracy, principles, values. Both those countries hold dear those values that Greece holds dear as well. So for us, it was a very welcome thing that they became partners in the NATO alliance. And a final remark on what we are doing. Well, we can talk for hours. Challenges are around the world, Caucasus, South China Sea, wherever. Each country has to do its part, and it's not just expenditure. Of course, Greece spends much more than 2%, and I have to say we're not really such a rich country that we're doing it without sacrificing needs that...
You spend a lot on pensions, though, don't you?
We do as well, yes, but much less than we did before the crisis. Okay. And we don't see it one as against the other. We see expenditure on defense, which sometimes go over even north of the 4% threshold, as the ticket to survival. And it's not just that we're spending, we are reforming which it's much more important than spending. We call it the 2030 agenda. And this is an agenda that will bring the Greek armed forces to the 21st century and even more than that, in all sectors of our armed forces, in the various concepts. But also what we're doing is we're introducing innovation in a fast lane in the Greek armed forces. And I believe that when we have finished with this reform, Greece will be able to have the strongest armed forces it ever had in our 3,000 years of existence. And that will be a contribution to security and stability in the region. Because as all participants in this discussion really underline, Greece is a country that offers whatever it can towards a rules-based order, towards international law of the sea, and towards peace and stability in the region.
Thank you. Well, we're coming up towards lunchtime here in Athens, so I'm going to ask you to be very brief, but if I could go back to you, Admiral Stavridis, on this question of Ukraine and NATO. You heard the suggestion that if there was a political agreement or if there was a truce of some sort and Ukraine were partially protected, that part of Ukraine should still be allowed to come into NATO, even if the war is not formally over, or even if all of Ukrainian territory before Russia's incursions were not restored. Would you think that that is something that NATO would consider doing and should do?
I would absolutely consider it. I think probably that's how this story turns out. There'll be kind of an interim step, a halfway house, if you will, where Ukraine, that portion of Ukraine that comes through the war, is offered significant security guarantees, probably NATO troops involved in training, but not that final admission to the club, that final golden ticket, probably another few years into the future. And I know that's frustrating to our Ukrainian friends, but that's the reality of managing our way to a negotiated conclusion here. Again, these are decisions for Ukrainians to make about their future and how they want to see this ultimately come out. I think NATO ought to obviously be highly engaged in continuing to train, equip, organize, and the new thing would be provide security guarantees. And very quickly after that, I'd say in another year or two, be very open to the idea of admission to NATO. So yes, I'll conclude with this. We want Ukraine on our team. When we get out of this war, I look at it as a supreme allied commander of NATO. Am I interested in having inside the alliance, part of the alliance, a nation that has been through war, has built its armed forces, has demonstrated incredible courage, is the most highly blooded army on the European continent with real battlefield experience? Do we want them on our team? I do. I think most NATO members will recognize the value in bringing them on the team. The only question is when.
Thank you. Very clear. David Harris, if I could turn back to you, and there was been much talk on the panel of values, the importance of values as well as military preparedness and deterrence. Does it worry you that the West, or in many Western countries, there doesn't seem to be a common understanding of the values at stake in what is happening in Gaza? We've seen on, even in the United States, big demonstrations on campus. We see the problems the Biden administration has with one wing of its own party. We see many similar dynamics in Europe as well. Is Israel in danger of losing the values argument?
The answer has to be an emphatic no. Not because I can bring you the empirical data, but because the alternative is too unfathomable to think about, quite honestly. But what we have here, and I think on October 7th, Daniel, I can be much more nuanced on many other issues involving Israel, but on October 7th, I don't see the room for nuance. And what I find particularly odd is these university responses in the United States that bring together what is often called, I think in Britain as well, the Red-Green Alliance. So you have Islamists and the population, the Muslim population in the United States is growing rapidly as it is in Europe. And I'm distinguishing between the Muslim population and within it, the Islamists. But understand and go to the Pew Research Center findings on the level of anti-Semitism in Muslim countries. From 100% or 99% in Lebanon and Jordan, I think the lowest number, if I recall correctly, of the countries surveyed was 70% in Turkey. It's these countries that are sending or witnessing the migration to Europe and the United States, and whatever other filters Europe and the United States are considering, filtering out anti-Semitism has not yet been figured out. So, number one, we have Islamists growing in number and professionalism, and there must be some coordination. This is not all ad hoc. And they are merged with neo-Marxists, anarchists, Antifa types in the most bizarre marriage. Because these so-called progressives are, I believe, embracing among the most regressive political causes on the planet. Don't believe me? Visit Gaza. Try being gay. Try being a woman and dressing in something other than traditional garb. Try being a drag queen. Try being a free thinker. Try being a labor organizer. All of the pillars of the value system of the left are in contradiction to what they're supporting. How this happened, Daniel, is a much deeper study. I will say that the organization I'm associated with now, chaired by Natan Sharansky, the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy, is finding, among other things, a big money trail that starts in the Middle East, principally in Doha, in Qatar, and finds its way openly and masqueraded to a number of American universities. That's not the only explanation, but it's one. So there are lots of factors going on here, and I would say, as my final point, Daniel, and sometimes I feel I'm speaking to myself. The Jews are only the tip of the iceberg, ladies and gentlemen. I don't know how many times it has to be said in history. When Hitler came after the Jews, in the end, up to 60 million Europeans were murdered, including more than 10% of the population of Greece. I don't want to call us the canary in the coal mine any longer, because the canary has to die from the methane gas for the miner to live, and I will be damned if I or my children or my grandchildren will play that role any further for the convenience of others. Wake up, world. Stand up and defend our democratic value system. They came after the Jews first in Libya. They came after the Jews first in Germany and Austria. They came after the Jews first in Iraq. But they're coming after the Saturday people, the Sunday people. And I suspect that's the majority of people in this room.
Again, the wake-up call. So just to take us to the pre-lunch comment from you, Ambassador, how do you think this leaves Greek-American relations, your core bailiwick?
I'm going to pivot slightly.
Go ahead.
During World War II, we often quote Martin Niemöller, a Lutheran pastor who said first they came for the trade unionists and I did nothing. Then they came for the socialists, and I did nothing. Then they came for the Jews, and I did nothing. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak up for me. But I like Dr. Johann Prinz, who was the chief rabbi of Berlin at the time, who talked about the Holocaust, and there have been other Holocausts and other genocides around the world. So I want to talk about the concept generally, and this is the inflection point that we find ourselves. He spoke about the greatest crime of the Holocaust was not the killing and the murder, it was the silence. And he spoke very specifically about my country, but we should speak about all of our countries. We cannot be silent onlookers. We cannot be silent onlookers. We have challenges. They may be existential threats to certain peoples and certain countries, but they are certainly threats to our own peaceful existence and how we coexist in this world. So we're going to have a sense of unity, a sense of planning on how we're going to address these issues. The challenges are significant. I have, in my life, I have never seen a collection of arcs of instability that surround this country in many, many years. So NATO, more significant than ever. The transatlantic relationship, more significant than ever. And, you know, you asked about Greece. I don't want to overstate this, and I don't know that I can. If you look at what surrounds Greece, and you look at Russian undermining of fledgling democracies in the Balkans, if you look at the fact that certain countries have, let me kindly put, autonomous foreign relations policies, and there is a very significant sort of sanctions avoidance mechanism that is operating, that is helping Russia survive and continue their war machine. And if you look at the, you know, my good friend spoke about the Sahel and Sudan, 10 million refugees. We're very concerned about the destabilization of Egypt. What the Houthis are doing to their income sources, it's $15 million every time a ship goes through the Suez Canal. And that has been cut by half. 9 million refugees there. This is some of the rhetoric creates great problems for some of the more moderate Arab countries to sort of keep this tragedy contained so it doesn't spread, and not everyone is helpful there. Greece is a pillar of stability surrounded by many, many arcs of instability. It really solidifies and anchors the Southeast NATO corridor. So we've talked about a lot of challenges. I want to end with a very positive note. I think we have identified that the peace dividend that came out of the falling of the Berlin Wall is over. I think the wealthiest nations in Europe can no longer spend 1% of their GDP. I think they've learned that. The problem is, and this is what I see as one of the biggest challenges that we don't talk enough, the industrial capability, certainly of Europe. There was a great article talking about the deindustrialization of Europe, but we cannot build things quickly enough. We cannot get artillery and missile defense and airplanes done quickly enough. It's a 5-year wait for a lot of these things. So, you know, we have a lot of challenges going forward. The solution is sort of an airplane that we're fixing and that we're creating as we're flying it. The ruse is over. The peace dividend is no longer an option. We're going to have to spend. We're going to have to create the infrastructure to be able to properly spend the money to not only bring these challenges to a conclusion, but to also make sure that there is an adequate deterrence that they don't happen again. And I will tell you, Greece is one of those countries in NATO that's playing an oversized role. They really punch upon their weight. And I'm going to quote my good friend, Admiral Cavoli. I don't know how I would solve a lot of these problems if we didn't have Greece in the NATO alliance and we didn't have Greece acting in the way they did. I would wish that every such country would act the same way. And I want to make one final comment about the country I have been privileged to be posted to. The credibility of Greece, an outstanding relationship with the United States, took a principled stand, the second country to sanction Russia after the invasion. And that was very difficult for them. But also maintaining an outstanding relationship with Israel. The first nation to visit Israel after October 7th was Greece. And they also maintained great relationships with the Arab world as well. So they act responsibly, and they're an essential ally in the region.
Well, thank you. Listen, ladies and gentlemen, I know we've gone over, we've tested your patience, but I hope you agree this was really important. Very, very fascinating and critical conversation. So I'd like to thank Admiral Stavridis remotely and everybody else here on the, who's on the podium. Thank you very much for taking us up to lunch so admirably. Thank you.